Now, have we got Craig Shirley? All right, Craig Shirley, welcome to the Laura Ingraham Show.
Yes.
Craig, you're on.
Oh, hi, how are you? Happy New Year.
Great. Happy New Year to you. Craig, I want to just introduce you briefly to our audience. You've been on the show before, of course,
right,
many times, but I just want to remind our audience that, among other things, you are the author of 3 best-selling books on former President Ronald Reagan. They are Rendezvous with Destiny, Ronald Reagan and the Campaign That Changed America, Reagan's Revolution, the untold story of the campaign that started it all, and the most recent one, Last Act, the final years and emerging legacy of Ronald Reagan. And Craig, what I really want to talk to you about this morning is a specific aspect of this year's presidential campaign, and that is foreign policy. Yep. And it's interesting to me, I'm old enough to remember when there was a big foreign policy debate going on within the Democratic Party. When you had Lyndon Johnson as president, you had Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy coming along as doves. You still had a military wing, the Scoop Jackson wing of the Democratic Party at that time. And for years there was a big debate over foreign policy and national defense in the Democratic Party. And that debate finally was resolved in favor of what I would say is just about flat out pacifism. And as you look at the Democratic presidential candidates today, is foreign policy really even on the radar screen?
Well, it's interesting over the years how foreign policy has evolved between the two parties. You know, after World War I, Americans had a very bad taste in their mouth, and there was a saying going around this country that all we got was death, debt, and George M. Cohen. And so we very much pulled back from the world. We convinced ourselves that we were walled off by 2 giant oceans. Europe was sick and decrepit. And we, passed a series of neutrality acts in the 1930s. The Democratic Congress signed happily by Franklin Roosevelt, and including some of the neutrality acts prohibited U.S. troops from leaving North America. So both parties were essentially isolationist in the 30s. Coming out of World War II, the Democratic Party had more the reputation of being internationalist, although there was a internationalist Dwight Eisenhower wing to the Republican Party, and the Democratic Party, through John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, was more internationalist. It was only when the Vietnam War turned bad and the growing anti-war movement on the campuses, and finally among the American people, did the Democratic Party become actually what is now the pacifist party.
Craig, if I could interrupt you for just a moment,
sure.
Most people nowadays don't remember that John Kennedy was probably the most anti-communist president we ever had.
He was probably more anti-communist than Richard Nixon in 1960. He ran on the missile gap that the United States was lagging behind the Soviets. He ran attacking the Eisenhower administration for letting Quemoy and Matsu, 2 tiny islands in the South China Sea, fall to communism, or whether or not they should fall to communism, and was very much a hawk in the 1960 campaign, probably more so than, as I said, as Richard Nixon.
Yeah, that's exactly right. But today, and I think we're seeing it in the presidential campaign for the 2016 race, and it's not a surprise to anybody, right? I mean, the only Democratic candidate who was even remotely a foreign policy hawk was Jim Webb, and
right.
He's the exception that proves the rule. He couldn't get over 1% in the polls.
Right. Well, Hillary, of course, voted to go into Iraq, but she's been, running away from that like a scalded dog. And then Bernie Sanders has been effectively hitting her on that position. She probably is slightly more hawkish now, but it's only a question of degrees. The real debate is inside the Republican Party, John, is that you have the neocon internationalist wing led by Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio, and then you have the more rational, what I would call Reagan-esque wing led by Rand Paul and others. Who Reagan believed really in committing American power to defend American interests, but not in nation building and not in global adventures. He only committed troops twice in his presidency, one in Grenada and the other in Lebanon. He always, to his dying day, regretted going into Lebanon.
Yeah, I think that's something that, a lot of people forget. Reagan had this reputation at the time of being the cowboy. Remember when he was testing a microphone?
The nuclear cowboy. He was a finger on the button.
The bombing will begin in 3 seconds or something.
Right.
And there was all editorial cartoons, Reagan the cowboy. The reality,
he was
of course.
the only president who effectively actually reduced in total the number of nuclear missiles in the world on the Soviet side and on the U.S. side.
That's right, by agreement with Gorbachev and the Soviet Union. And, of course, Reagan did supervise the major buildup of the American military and,
That's right.
and so forth, that eventually more or less bankrupted the Soviet Union when they tried to keep up. But Reagan won the Cold War really without firing a shot.
Well, that's true, but also it was a long, tough, hard-fought battle involving sometimes there were client states, sometimes there were proxy states, in obviously Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Korea, other flashpoints throughout the years, throughout the Cold War and the fight with Soviet and Chinese communism. So a lot of people, did die. Although Reagan always thought the Vietnam War was a noble cause and went out of his way to say so, and was pilloried by the elites for calling the Vietnam War a noble cause.
Yeah, that's right. And your point is very well taken. I mean, clearly over that whole era of bipartisan foreign policy following World War II, before the Democrats went dovish after 1968, there was armed conflict. Korea and Vietnam being the really obvious instances.
Right.
But at least during Reagan's tenure as president, it's with hindsight, I think it's kind of remarkable that for as much as at the time, people were deriding him as the wild cowboy, and so on, the reality was really very different. And he really won, finished off the victory in the Cold War. Not to give him sole credit by any means.
But ironically,
but he did
that
it with strategy.
Served his purposes. That reputation served his purposes because there was no, by all documentation, Soviet GRU files, KGB files, there was no Western leader who struck fear in the hearts of the Kremlin and Moscow more than Ronald Reagan. They really did believe that he was a mad nuclear bomber who might start World War III, and they knew that they could never win World War III. So that reputation actually served him very well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. What about the fact that the Iranians released 300 or so American hostages that they'd held for over a year?
Within minutes of his becoming president.
Right. On the day he was inaugurated, they said, okay, well, I think we've had enough of these hostages. We better let them go. I don't know how to interpret that except as an indication that they bought into this idea that Reagan was a dangerous guy who just might, do something real serious.
Well, I interviewed the charge d'affaires of the American Embassy for my book, Rendezvous with Destiny. He was also convinced and told me that he was convinced the Iranians released them only after Reagan became president because they feared Ronald Reagan. They didn't fear or respect Jimmy Carter.
No, that is clear. So, Craig, I'm interested though to hear you describe Rand Paul as a guy who you would put in the Reagan-esque defense tradition. I've never thought of Rand Paul that way. To me, while not as much of an isolationist as his father, who I think really was just a flat-out isolationist, Paul has certainly softened that libertarian, aspect of his politics. But doesn't Rand Paul favor significant military cuts? And as a practical matter, isn't he a guy who would be awfully passive in foreign affairs? Or do you think I'm misreading him?
No, I think you're right. I only indicated Rand Paul as kind of a marker between the George W. Bush wing of the neocon wing and the isolationist wing. Reagan was neither, and neither is Rand Paul. Reagan was probably a little bit tougher, was probably a little bit more tougher, in favor of stronger national defense than maybe Rand Paul. But times have changed too, and so the definitions become somewhat fluid. So, we have to be careful not to be, too hard and fast in our identifications.
Yeah, that's right. Threats are different today, so we look to the past for inspiration and for analogy, but it's never a perfect correspondence.
Right.
Craig Shirley, thank you so much for being with us. Look forward to having you on the show again before long.
Thank you, John. Take care.